It's funny how a book titled Atomic Habits almost sounds like a science fiction novel, doesn't it?
It does have a certain ring to it, but it's that idea of atomic, the smallest possible unit, that's really intriguing. We're talking about, the power of tiny changes, those seemingly insignificant actions we take every single day.
And James Clear's own story is a great example of this, right? He didn't just wake up one day as a best-selling author. This guy had to rebuild his life, literally, after that awful baseball injury in high school.
It really is remarkable when you think about it. He was in a coma, couldn't walk properly for months. It would have been easy to give up on his goals.
But instead, he focused on what he could control, on building tiny habits day after day. From a hospital bed to academic All-American, that's quite a testament to the power of consistency.
What's fascinating to me is how this connects to the idea of the habit loop, this four-step process. Clear outlines. Cue, craving, response, reward. Imagine Clear in those early days, recovering from his injury. It would have been so easy to get discouraged, right?
Oh, absolutely. To focus on how far he had to go instead of the progress he was making. So
Yeah.
how did he use this habit loop to his advantage?
Well, let's break it down. Let's say his cue was simply waking up in the morning. Instead of focusing on the pain or limitations, he could shift his craving, his internal motivation, towards a small win. Maybe it was doing 5 more minutes of physical therapy than the day before.
Okay.
The response is the action itself and the reward. The feeling of accomplishment, of moving one step closer to his goal.
So even though the reward was small, it reinforced the habit loop, making it more likely he'd repeat the process the next day.
Exactly. It's like building a muscle, but for your willpower. And the more he repeated these small wins, the more they became part of his identity. This is where it goes beyond just checking things off a to-do list.
Right. It's not just about wanting to be a certain way. It's about becoming that person through your actions.
Precisely. So instead of saying, I want to be more disciplined, you start embodying the identity of a disciplined person through small, consistent habits. And as you act in alignment with that identity, it becomes more ingrained.
It's interesting because Clear also talks about how our habits shape our identity and vice versa. It's like a two-way street.
Yeah.
So if we want to change our habits, we might need to start by changing how we see ourselves. How do we start to shift that internal narrative? Is it as simple as just deciding to be a certain way?
It's definitely more nuanced than just flipping a switch. It's about recognizing the stories we tell ourselves, the beliefs we hold about who we are and what we're capable of. Let's take the example of someone who wants to be a writer.
Okay, so they want to write a novel, but struggle to find the time or motivation.
Right. Now, imagine if they started simply by identifying as a writer, even if they haven't published a single word. They start incorporating small writing habits into their day. Maybe it's just 15 minutes of journaling in the morning or jotting down ideas on their lunch break.
So they're acting in alignment with their desired identity, even if it feels a bit like playing pretend at first.
Exactly. And as they do this consistently, as they see themselves showing up as a writer day after day, that identity becomes more real, more ingrained. And that's where the magic happens, because then the habits become less about willpower and more about simply being who you are.
It's almost like you're removing the internal resistance, that feeling of should, and replacing it with I am. So how does this play into the 4 laws of behavior change that Clear talks about?
Ah, yes. These are really where the rubber meets the road, those practical tools for building better habits. And, they're incredibly effective when you start to see how they connect to this idea of identity. Let's take the first law, making
Mhm.
it obvious. Remember the cue, that trigger that starts the habit loop?
Right, like in our earlier example, it was Clear waking up and focusing on that small win in his recovery. But how do we make cues more obvious in everyday life? It can't all be about recovering from an injury.
Of course not. But the principle is the same. It's about designing your environment in a way that supports your desired habits. Clear gives this great example about the way Japanese train conductors use a system called point and call to reduce errors.
Train conductors using a specific system to reduce errors. It sounds so simple, yet so powerful. What exactly is point and call, and how does it work?
It's fascinating, isn't it? They literally point at an object, a signal, a gauge, whatever, and call out what they're doing. Like,
Right.
signal clear, brakes released. It seems almost too basic, but what it does is bring that action into conscious awareness.
So it's like they're creating a deliberate pause, a moment of mindfulness before each step. And by doing so, they're less likely to make careless mistakes.
Exactly. And think about how we can apply that to our own lives. If you're trying to break the habit of mindless snacking, for example, you could use point and call every time you open the pantry. Literally point at the healthy snack and say, this is what I'm choosing.
It sounds a bit silly, but I can see how it would make you more aware of your choices. Okay, so we've made it obvious. We've set up our environment and cues to support our desired habit.
Hmm.
What's the next step? Making it attractive, Renee.
Precisely. We need to tap into that part of our brain that loves rewards and positive associations. Clear talks about how social norms can play a big role here. We are wired to, want to fit in, to do what others around us are doing.
So if we surround ourselves with people who embody our desired habits, we're more likely to adopt them ourselves.
That's the general idea. And there's actually a fascinating study Claire mentions about hand washing in Pakistan. The researchers wanted to improve hygiene practices in a community where diarrhea was a serious problem. Simply telling people to wash their hands more often wasn't enough.
Because everyone already knew it was important, but old habits die hard. So how do they make hand washing more attractive?
They partnered with Procter & Gamble to provide free Safeguard soap to the community.
So they made it aspirational. Suddenly, it's not just about hygiene. It's about using a desirable product.
Exactly. And it worked. The rates of diarrhea dropped significantly. Now think about how you can apply this to your own habits. Could you join a running club if you want to make running a regular part of your life? Or find a community online that supports your desire to eat healthier.
It's about finding your tribe, those people who are already living the way you want to live. So we've made it obvious, we've made it attractive. What's next? Making it easy.
You got it. And this is where the 2-minute rule comes in. The idea is to make starting a new habit so incredibly easy that you can't say no. Bring it down to the smallest possible step, something that takes 2 minutes or less.
So instead of trying to run a 5K, you just focus on putting on your running shoes and getting out the door.
Exactly. You're removing all the friction, all the excuses your brain can come up with. And once you've taken that first small step, you're much more likely to keep going.
It's like building that initial momentum, that feeling of, well, I've started, so I might as well keep going. Okay, so we've made it obvious, attractive, easy. What's the final piece of the puzzle?
Making it satisfying. This is all about the reward, the positive feedback loop that reinforces the habit.
Okay, satisfying. This is where it gets really interesting, right? Because we're talking about rewiring our brains to crave the things that are good for us.
Exactly. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through immediate rewards. Our brains are wired to prioritize instant gratification over long-term benefits. So how do we bridge that gap?
We find ways to make those healthy habits feel rewarding in the moment. Instead of focusing on the scale moving after a week of healthy eating, we savor the deliciousness of a freshly prepared meal.
Exactly. Celebrate those small wins along the way. Another powerful technique is habit tracking. Something as simple as marking an X on a calendar can give you a sense of accomplishment, a visual representation of your progress.
It's like you're building a chain, link by link, and breaking that chain is almost physically painful. Okay, so we've covered the 4 laws, but there's one more big idea from the book we haven't touched on yet. Finding your zone of growth. This feels less about specific habits and more about finding the right activities, the ones that align with our natural strengths and interests.
It's about recognizing that we're all wired differently, and what feels effortless for one person might feel like an uphill battle for another. Clear uses the example of those marathon runners, Michael Phelps and Hichmel Garouge, to illustrate this point.
One built tall and lean, the other short and compact, yet both perfectly suited to long-distance running. They found their niche, the area where their natural abilities gave them an advantage.
Exactly. And that's not to say you can't succeed in areas outside your natural strengths, but it does require more conscious effort. It's like swimming upstream versus downstream. You can still reach your destination, but it takes more work.
So how do we find our own version of swimming downstream? How do we discover those activities where we can truly thrive?
It's a process of exploration and experimentation. Clear talks about the Goldilocks rule, the idea that peak motivation comes from tasks that are just slightly beyond our current ability.
Not too easy, not too hard, but just challenging enough to keep us engaged. It's that feeling of being in the zone, when you're so engrossed in an activity that time seems to fly by.
Exactly. And the key is to find that sweet spot in different areas of your life. Maybe you're naturally gifted at writing, but you struggle with organization. The challenge then becomes finding ways to make organization more engaging, to break it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
So finding your zone of growth isn't about staying within your comfort zone. It's about strategically pushing yourself just beyond those boundaries. It's about recognizing that even if we master these atomic habits, growth requires a willingness to embrace discomfort, to venture into those areas where we might not be naturally gifted.
Precisely. And that's where the real magic happens, because when we challenge ourselves to grow beyond our perceived limitations, we unlock a whole new level of potential.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into atomic habits, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Small changes, consistently applied, can lead to remarkable results. It's about understanding the science of habit formation, finding what works for you, and embracing the journey of continuous improvement.
And remember, it's not about perfection, it's about progress. Start small, stay consistent, and keep your eyes on the long game.
You got this. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning,
Yeah.
and keep building those atomic habits.